Good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible class on the book of Isaiah. Tonight we're going to be discussing chapters, we're still going to start with chapter 2. Now chapters 2 through 4, actually 2 through 5 represent one block in the book of Isaiah, one section, a prophecy. And we'll be looking at chapter 2 tonight, and later on we'll be discussing chapter 3 probably at a later time this week. Now, I hope that all of you have engaged in prayer before you started this lesson, and I would also hope that you had done your reading. You read chapters 1 through 3 in the book of Isaiah, and if you haven't at this time, you may want to shut the video off and then do this and then come back and continue watching it. Now, in chapters 2 through 4, the outline would be the inception of the coming Messiah. That's what this chapter begins to introduce here, specifically in verses 1 through 4 in chapter 2. And we have the institution of the Lord's house, which we can see here in verses 1 through 4 in chapter 2. And it tells us here in the word of Isaiah, the son of Amos, the word which Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it's interesting when you kind of think about this, okay? If we have the word, and then over in chapter 1 we have the vision. And Joseph Alexander said the word, revelation or divine communication, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw, perceived, received by divine inspiration concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now if you look on, you'll find this in page 97 in his commentary. Now Joseph Alexander kind of was surmising that vision and word are synonymous because of the way that they've used in Isaiah's writing. And they're both referencing the work of the divine prophet. Now in some occasions, actually one in particular, it's evident. This is very evident. Now if you go over to 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 1, you can read over there. It says, "And now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord before Eli, and the word from the Lord was rare in those days. Vision was infrequent." This is 1 Samuel 3:1. Now Homer Haley said, "To see the word is to comprehend and understand its message." And he also went on to say that Isaiah saw the vision, the word, and understood both it and its source. And the word and the vision both came from God. That's on page 45 in his book. Now, in verses 2 through 4 in chapter 2, we begin to read, "And now it will come to pass in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream unto it. And many people will come and say, Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God, the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we will walk in his paths, and the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." Now, it's interesting to note this, that the mountain of the house of the Lord, this is obviously prophecy concerning the establishment of the Lord's church. And it's also evident that when we think about the time frame of this, that it would occur in the last days. The phrase last days is also referenced about 150 years later in the book of Daniel. And Daniel the prophet, when he gives the time frame in which Nebuchadnezzar's dream would come to fruition, and you get an opportunity to go to Daniel chapter 2 and look at verse 28. Please look at the context of the dream. I'll read chapter 2 through, and specifically note. Let's for instance, let's turn over there. We're going to specifically note in this lesson verses 44 and 45 in Daniel chapter 2. So turn with me to Daniel chapter 2, just a few books over from Isaiah, and we're going to read this passage here, just a couple verses at the end of chapter 2. And we read, this is verse 44, "In the days of these kings," speaking of the kings that are mentioned in verses 40 through 43, the Empire of Iron. And this is the Roman Empire, and you can go back and you can check these kingdoms through history, and you can see what each one of them pertains to. And it tells us in the days of these kings, during the days of the Roman Caesars, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and that kingdom shall not be left to another people. They will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. It's talking about all the ones that came before. The Babylonian, the gold kingdom, Medes and the Persians, the silver kingdom, the Greek kingdom, which was Greece, which was brass, and then of course Rome, the kingdom of iron. And he says it will not be left to another people. It will crush and put the end to all these kings, but it will itself endure forever, insomuch as that you saw the stone cut out of the mountain without hands, and it crushed the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and the interpretation is trustworthy. See, Daniel not only gave Nebuchadnezzar the interpretation, but he also told him what his dream was. And that was something that his wise men could not do. They couldn't tell him what the dream was, and therefore he couldn't trust their interpretation. But Daniel both told him the dream and the interpretation. Now, he gives us the time frame here, because these two verses provide a time fulfillment. In Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, it's talking about this same time frame. Now, the Lord's house was to be on the top of the mountains. This is not speaking literally a place in the mountains, but it did start in Jerusalem. Exalted above all the hills, all nations would flow to it. You know, the writer of Hebrews, if you go to Hebrews and you study chapter 12, verses 18 through 24, there's a contrast that's drawn between Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. Now, Jerusalem was in the mountains, and Isaiah was having he's giving us an imagery of the majestic as well as the magnificence of the spiritual kingdom, the church. Now, Homer Haley said the mountain would be established and exalted above all other mountains. It would transcend all kingdoms of the world in greatness and grandeur. Now, the word of the Lord was to go forth from Jerusalem. And it tells us here in this passage, if you look at verse 3, and it tells us that many of the people will come and say, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. And when you think about this particular passage here, Isaiah is talking about people wanting to go there, wanting to go up to it. In fact, many will want to do this. Chuck Horner says people will be astounded and they'll want to investigate it. And this was true when this was to take place, and it's also true today. People still want to investigate the kingdom of God. Now, if you go over to Acts chapter 2, verses 6 through 12, there were people there on the day of Pentecost that wanted to investigate what was going on. God's law, his word would be taught. He shall teach us his ways. Now, this is a reference to Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20, as well as Hebrews chapter 8, 18 through 13. Now, Brother Horner also said the law and the word of God mean the same thing. It's talking about the gospel. So the gospel was preached in the beginning in Jerusalem, and out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word from Jerusalem. Thus the gospel be preached and the beginning, or at the beginning. The beginning would be in Jerusalem. Now, if you go to Acts chapter 2 and you read 14 through 36, you can see this, that this is when the gospel began to be preached. In fact, Peter preached the first gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost. Now, we go to verse 4 here of Isaiah chapter 2. It says, and he will judge between the nations and render decisions for many people, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn of war. Now, this doesn't mean that there's never going to be any wars. We'll talk about this a little right shortly here, what this means. God will judge between the nations and rebuke many, And they will hammer their weapons of war into farming implements. Things that are going to be productive, things that are going to do good, instead of cause harm and triage and tragedy and trepidation. This is symbolic of the peaceful nature of the church when they're talking about taking these weapons of war and hammering them into plowshares and pruning hooks. And it's also talking about God's kingdom. And now if you go to Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11 through 22, it gives us a pretty good understanding here of peace. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 2. We're going to read verses 11 through 22. Therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcised by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands, remember that you were at times separated from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ, for he himself is our peace, who made both groups into one, and broke down the barrier, the dividing wall, by abolishing in his flesh the enmity which is in the law of commandments contained in the ordinances, so that in himself he might make the two into one new man, thus establishing peace. Okay, and this peace came forth because of the work of Christ. And if you continue to read on down here, it says, and he came to preach peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. And this is the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel is peace. And turn with me over to Colossians. We're going to look at Colossians chapter 3. And we're going to look at verse 15 in Colossians. Colossians 3:15. And it tells us here, let us therefore, as many of us are perfect, have an attitude, anything different. Excuse me, I'm in Philippians. Let me get to Colossians with you. No wonder that didn't make any sense. It tells us here, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, which indeed you were called into one body, and be thankful. This is talking pretty much along the same lines of what was discussed in Ephesians, that the peace comes through the preaching of the gospel, which comes through Christ giving himself for us. Now, the message of the Lord's church is the peace, is the gospel of peace. Now, Paul Butler said peace comes through comes through and doing the will of God. Comes through and doing the will of God voluntarily, not by force. Now, the Apostle Paul said, if it be possible, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. That's Romans chapter 12, verse 18. So if people want to learn God's ways, his teaching, and we therefore, while we desire to walk in them, the end result would be peace and productivity. And their bodies and talents, which they formerly used for unrighteous acts, will be beaten into plowshares and pruning hooks, and while these are the tools of productivity in the vineyard of the Lord, profitable, okay, for glorifying God and serving others. Now, I want you also to reference here Romans chapter 6, verses 12 through 20. That would be another passage you might want to investigate and look at. Now, this brings us to our second point in chapter 2, in chapter 2, and that's Isaiah chapter 2, 5 through 9, and we'll call this the insurrection of God's people, since I've been trying to follow this I theme, using the word I in all my titles and my headings here. Now, in 5 through 9, God continues to offer an invitation, as he offered over in chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. And we see this invitation. It says, "Come, house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." This is Isaiah writing to them, telling him, encouraging this, offering this invitation. And he gives them the reason why they need to walk in the light of the Lord. In verse 6, "For you have abandoned your people, the house of Jacob." And then as we get into this next section, he goes through several things that they have, their land they have been filled with. And to walk in the light of the Lord requires one to abandon materialism, and in this particular case, idolatry, as we'll discuss it a little bit more. Now, the moral decadence is of their nation. The moral decadence of their nation is illustrated by the use of the word filled 4 times. It's talking about filled. They were filled with these things. It wasn't like they had some of it or a little bit of it. They were filled with it. Now, the first thing they were filled with, you can find in verse 6, it says, because they were filled with influences from the east. This is another reason that's presented here. Now, these influences from the east, or the eastern philosophies, they were things like soothsayers. They became soothsayers. To act, and this means to act covertly, to cloud over. It's that practicing magic is what we're talking about here. Observer of the times, trying to foretell the future. And these things are all forbidden by Deuteronomy. If you go to Deuteronomy 18:10 that we did in the last lesson, we talked about the first test of a false prophet, which is found in Deuteronomy 18:15 through 22. In this text, we see that it was a capital crime under the law of Moses to do this, to act this way. And God forbid it, and there was a reason why God forbid it. He didn't want them doing it. He didn't. It was punishable by death, by being stoned. Now, the second thing that the land was filled with, you can find also in verse 7, the land had been filled with silver and gold. They had prosperity, economic prosperity, and they had become very greedy because of this economic prosperity. Now, the third thing that's mentioned herein, that the land was filled with horses and chariots. They had great might, great military might. To coin the phrase, or actually President Eisenhower coined the phrase, he talked about the military-industrial complex, and that's kind of what had happened here in Judah, that they had put their trust in their military might and not in God. And that's pretty much the message of Isaiah anyway, is to trust God and not men. Now in verse 8 you'll find another filling. The land had been filled with idols. And this was the most tragic of all. When you think of all these other things, this was the most tragic, because their worship was profane. Their worship was an abomination. It was totally against God. They worshipped the creation made by their own hands. That's what it tells us here. He goes on in verse 8 and says they worshipped the work of their hands that their fingers had made. And you think about this. They'd forgot God, who actually is the one who made their hands, and they were using their hands to make these idols which were evil, these idols which were an abomination to God. They were totally against what God wanted them to do, and they made them and they worshipped them. Now let's go over to Isaiah chapter 44, and we're going to do a kind of a lengthy reading here, but I think it's important, and I'll give you a couple of other readings that you can do on your own. This is talking about the problem of idolatry. It was a serious situation, and it's one that you can see that Isaiah dealt with a lot in his writing. Now, if you go over to Isaiah chapter 44, verse 9, it tells us the folly of idolatry. He says, "Those who fashion a graven image are all of them futile, and their precious things are of no profit. Even their own witnesses fail to see or know, so they will be put to shame. Who has fashioned a god or cast an idol to no profit? Behold, all his companions will be put to shame, for the craftsmen themselves are mere men. Let them all assemble themselves, let them stand up, let them tremble, let them together be put to shame. If a man shapes iron into a cutting tool and does this work over the coals and fashions with it hammers and working it with a strong arm, he also gets hungry and his strength fails and he drinks no water and becomes weary. You think about this, a man taking and making these tools out of iron to make an idol. And then he goes on to say in verse 13, and another shapes wood. One works with iron, another shapes wood. He extends a measuring line, he outlines it with red chalk, he works it with planes, and he outlines it with a compass, and he makes it like the form of men, like the beauty of a man, so that it may sit in his house. Surely he cuts the cedars for himself, and he takes the cypress and an oak, and he raises it for himself among the trees in the forest. And he plants a fir, and the rain makes it grow. Then it becomes something for a man to burn. So he takes one of them, warming himself, and he also makes a fire to bake bread, and he also makes a god to worship it. He makes a graven image and falls down before it. Half of it he burns by fire, over half he eats meat as he roasts a roast and is satisfied. He also warms himself and says, I am warm, I have seen a fire. But the rest of it he makes into a god, his graven image. He falls down before it and worships it, and he prays and says to it, deliver me, for you are my God. And you know, as you think of this, you think of there's almost no words really to describe what you would think about this when you sit down and you take and break this down and read it and analyze it and think it through. In verse 18, they do not know, nor do they utter or understand, for he has smeared over their eyes, so they cannot see, their hearts, so that they cannot comprehend. No one recalls, nor is it knowledge or understanding to say, I have burned half of it in a fire, and I have also baked bread over its coals, and I roasted meat to eat it, and then I made the rest into an abomination, and I fall down over a block of wood. And he feeds on ashes, and a deceived heart is turned aside and cannot deliver himself to say, is there not a lie in my right hand? When you think about this, this is just amazing when you read this, how Isaiah describes idol worship, the deprivation of it, and how just he brings it down to such simple terms here. When he talks about how, you know, they burn part of it, they cook over it, then they make it into a god, and they fall down and worship it and pray that it'll deliver them. How ridiculous that is. Now, I also have a couple more readings I'd like you to look at and explore on your own. This is Isaiah chapter 40. I want you to go there, and I want you to read 18 through 31, if you would, please. Isaiah 40, 18 through 31 would be more another reading similar to this on the same subject as idolatry. Now, also, I'd want you to also take a look, if you want to do a further reading, in Isaiah 41, 21 through 29, Isaiah 41, 21 through 29. Now let's go back to Isaiah chapter 2. We've kind of taken a long sidetrack here. And when you look at verse 9 of Isaiah chapter 2, it says, so the common man has been humbled, and the man of importance has been abased, but do not forgive them. Now, when you look at this verse, he's talking about how all men are brought low. They're just mean, you know, we're talking about mean men. In some translations it refers to mean men or common men. It means men of low rank brought low, with all men that worship idols. All the men that worship idols are going to be brought low. Now we get into the next section of chapter 2, and this is called the indignation of Jehovah, day of reckoning for sinners. And this is Isaiah chapter 2, 10 through 22. Now as we begin in this, we see that man's terror You know, the terror of